Welcome to Dark Night Tales. Tonight, we uncover a chilling story from the heart of Georgia, where a cruel master served his enslaved people the worst food imaginable. Bland, spoiled, and barely edible. But fate has a way of turning the tables. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories based on true historical events. Tons of research and hidden truths await you. In the heart of Georgia, during the antebellum era, there existed a sprawling plantation that seemed picturesque from a distance. Lush fields stretching under the sun, rows of cotton ready for harvest, and grand white columns lining the main house. But behind this facade of wealth and order lay a harsh and unforgiving reality. The plantation was ruled by a master whose cruelty was whispered about far beyond the estate's borders. Known for his strict control and merciless punishments, he maintained his power not only through fear and violence, but also through starvation and humiliation. Every aspect of life on the plantation was dictated by his whims, and the enslaved people lived in constant anxiety, never knowing what might trigger his anger. While visitors might have admired the property from the outside, inside, it was a place where hope was scarce, and survival depended on endurance, secrecy, and a deep understanding of the master's unpredictable nature. This was the stage for one of the most ironic and haunting moments in the plantation's history, a night when the very cruelty he imposed on others would come back to confront him in a way he could never have imagined. If you want, I can expand Keynote 2 next, detailing the daily life of the enslaved people in the same chilling and immersive style, perfect for your YouTube narrative. Do you want me to continue with that? Life for the enslaved people on this Georgia plantation was grueling from sunrise to sunset. Each morning began before the first light, with the shrill call of the overseer's horn or the master's bell signaling the start of endless labor. Men, women, and even children were forced into the fields, picking cotton under the blazing sun, their hands raw and blistered, their bodies aching with exhaustion. There was little rest, and every action was closely watched. A misstep could mean punishment, often brutal and public, to serve as a warning to others. Inside the quarters, conditions were no less harsh. Cramped cabins with dirt floors and leaky roofs offered scant protection from Georgia's sweltering heat and torrential rains. Food was meager, mostly leftovers or the scraps deemed unworthy of the master's table, and often spoiled, leaving many weak and sick. Despite the deprivation, enslaved people found ways to preserve small joys, whispered songs of hope, secret prayers, or quiet moments of storytelling under the night sky. These acts of resilience were tiny rebellions against a life designed to break them. Every day was a test of endurance, not just of the body, but of the spirit. The enslaved learned to navigate the dangers of the master's wrath, obeying when necessary, hiding knowledge when possible, and dreaming of freedom even when hope seemed impossible. This daily grind of pain and perseverance set the stage for a night that would become infamous. A night when the cruelty they endured was, for once, turned back toward the man who inflicted it. On this Georgia plantation, the meals given to the enslaved people were barely enough to sustain life, and often they were downright dangerous. Mornings might begin with a thin gruel or porridge made from watered, down cornmeal, sometimes laced with grit or small stones that had fallen in during preparation. Lunch could be a handful of moldy bread, a few scraps of salted pork, or vegetables pulled hastily from a neglected garden, often overcooked or partially rotten. Dinner, when there was one, followed the same grim pattern: soupy stews with questionable meat, root vegetables that had begun to spoil, or leftovers the master deemed unfit for his own table. Hygiene was non-existent. Cooking pots were rarely cleaned. Water was stagnant or drawn from the same muddy stream that ran past the fields, and food was often infested with insects or worms. Any attempt to complain or refuse the food risked punishment, so the enslaved people ate what they could or went hungry. Malnutrition and illness were common. Bloated bellies, fevers, and chronic weakness became everyday sights. Despite the horrors of these meals, the enslaved endured, often sharing portions among each other to stretch the little they had. They developed subtle ways to make the food more bearable, adding a pinch of salt, scavenging wild herbs, or discarding the worst parts, but the cruelty was intentional. The master understood that food was a tool of control, and by serving the worst, he maintained his dominance, keeping their bodies weak and their spirits tethered to his power. Little did he know, this very cruelty would become his undoing on one fateful night, when he would be forced to confront the same horrors he had inflicted for so long. The master of this Georgia plantation viewed food not merely as sustenance, but as a weapon and a tool to reinforce his absolute authority. To him, what his slaves ate, and what they didn't eat, was a reflection of his power. He believed that denying them proper meals kept them dependent, submissive, and easier to control. Every mealtime was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of dominancy. The slaves received only what he deemed necessary to keep them alive, while he dined on rich, carefully prepared dishes, seemingly indifferent to their suffering. He would often watch from the veranda or his study as the enslaved lined up to receive their portions, his eyes sharp for any sign of hesitation, complaint, or dissatisfaction. If a meal appeared too good, or portions seemed unfairly distributed, he would punish those he considered daring to question the hierarchy. This control extended to the kitchen as well. Slaves who prepared food were scrutinized constantly, forced to work under the threat of whipping if even the smallest mistake occurred. The master also took perverse pleasure in the contrast his lavish, flavorful dinners set against the barely edible scraps served to those who labored under his command. It was a psychological game as much as a physical one. He saw it as his right, his entitlement to inflict this suffering, and he rarely imagined that the same food could ever turn against him. Little did he know, his obsession with control through food, his arrogance and cruelty would ultimately lead to a moment of reckoning, a night when he would be forced to consume the very meals he had used as instruments of oppression. That night, his carefully maintained power would falter in a way no one could have predicted. The enslaved people on this Georgia plantation lived in a constant state of hunger and illness, yet somehow they endured. Malnutrition was widespread. Bellies often swelled painfully from a lack of proper nourishment, while energy and strength slowly ebbed away. Weakness made the grueling labor in the fields even more unbearable, but there was no choice. They had to work to survive, to avoid punishment, and to preserve whatever small scraps of dignity remained. Sickness was an almost daily companion. Contaminated water, spoiled food, and exposure to the harsh elements left many with fevers, stomach pains, and chronic ailments. Wounds and infections, if left untreated, could turn deadly, yet access to proper care was nearly non-existent. Sometimes, older or more experienced slaves attempted to nurse the sick with herbal remedies or shared portions of their meager rations, but these efforts were small shields against an overwhelming tide of suffering. Psychologically, the enslaved people developed extraordinary resilience. Starvation and illness forged a silent strength, a network of quiet endurance and mutual support. They whispered advice, passed along remedies, and comforted one another when the pain became unbearable. In the face of relentless cruelty, these small acts of compassion and solidarity were revolutionary. Their endurance was not just physical, it was deeply mental. They learned to conceal weakness from the master, to mask the toll of hunger and disease, and to carry on as if the cruelty did not break them. Every day survived was a testament to human willpower, and this resilience would eventually become central to the night, when the master would face the consequences of his own cruelty. On the plantation, whispers of the master's cruelty spread like wildfire among the enslaved people. Even when fear kept them outwardly obedient, in the quiet corners of cabins or under the cover of night, they shared stories, some true, some exaggerated, about the punishments he inflicted. These rumors served multiple purposes. They warned newcomers of what awaited them, bonded the enslaved through shared experiences of terror, and provided a subtle form of resistance by keeping the memory of injustice alive. Some spoke of slaves who had been whipped mercilessly for the smallest mistakes, their screams echoing across the fields as warnings to others. Others recounted tales of those forced to labor through sickness or frost, collapsing only to be dragged back to work by overseers. There were stories of meals intentionally spoiled or tainted, where the master would laugh as the enslaved struggled to swallow food that made them ill. These narratives became a collective memory of oppression, a shared knowledge that both horrified and united them. At the same time, the rumors carried a mix of fear and dark amusement. Slaves speculated about the master's weaknesses, imagining what might happen if the tables were turned. What if he had to eat what we eat? They would whisper to one another, barely daring to speak the thought aloud. It was a tiny spark of rebellion, a dream, however fleeting, that justice could find its way, even in the cruelest of circumstances. These whispered stories, passed from one generation of laborers to the next, kept the tension high and the anticipation palpable. They set the stage for the night when fate intervened, when the master, so obsessed with control and cruelty, would be confronted with the very horrors he inflicted, experiencing firsthand the suffering he had long inflicted on others. The preparation of meals for the enslaved people on this Georgia plantation was an ordeal in itself, carried out with efficiency, but without care, nutrition, or hygiene. The kitchen was a dark, cramped space, often suffused with smoke from the hearth and the pungent odor of spoiled ingredients. Cooks, usually enslaved women, worked under the oppressive gaze of overseers, knowing that any slip-up, even a minor one, could bring a whipping. Every meal was a reminder of their subjugation, crafted not for sustenance, but as a tool of control. Cornmeal, the staple of most dishes, was often coarse and mixed with sand or grit from the ground, making it difficult to swallow. Meats, when available, were heavily salted or left from previous meals, sometimes beginning to rot. Yet they were deemed edible enough to serve to the laborers. Vegetables were often overcooked into mush or taken from a garden too small and poorly maintained to provide adequate nutrition. Even water for cooking could be stagnant or contaminated, adding another layer of danger to an already hazardous diet. The process was mechanical and dehumanizing. There was no flavor, no variety, only the minimum required to keep the enslaved alive enough to work the next day. The master rarely involved himself in the preparation directly, but he inspected the meals frequently, ensuring that nothing would improve the lives of those under his control. The cooks learned to adapt, sometimes discarding the worst bits secretly, other times mixing scraps to stretch meager portions, but their efforts could only do so much against the systemic cruelty imposed from above. These meals were symbolic of the larger oppression. They were reminders that every aspect of the enslaved people's lives was dictated, constrained, and deliberately made difficult. And yet, the very cruelty that went into preparing these meals would one night turn against the master himself, forcing him to confront the food in a way that no overseer, no punishment, and no fear could prevent. One night on the plantation felt different from all the others. The air was heavy with humidity, and the usual sounds of crickets and distant fieldwork seemed muted, almost foreboding. The enslaved people whispered among themselves, sensing that something was about to break the pattern of daily suffering. A subtle tension ran through the quarters and fields. Even the dogs were restless, barking sporadically at shadows that seemed larger than usual. The master, unaware of the unease around him, prepared for his evening meal with the same arrogance and routine he always displayed. But that night, a rare combination of events aligned. The kitchen, normally filled with the sounds of hurried chopping and simmering pots, was quieter. The cooks moved cautiously, aware that any mistake could have consequences, but there was an almost imperceptible change in the rhythm of the household. The enslaved people, sensing a shift, exchanged looks, silent signals that something extraordinary was unfolding. Rumors had circulated for weeks among them. What if the master had to eat the very food he had long forced them to endure? That night, the thought lingered in hushed tones, like a dark premonition. The fields were empty, the cabins shadowed, and the plantation seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind through the trees carried an eerie stillness, as though nature itself were aware of the impending reversal of fortune. It was a night unlike any other, where the weight of cruelty, control, and suffering seemed to converge. The enslaved people went about their duties quietly, hearts pounding with anticipation and fear, knowing that something was about to happen that would change the course of that evening forever, when the master would be forced to confront the consequences of his own tyranny in the most intimate and horrifying way imaginable. As the evening progressed, the master, ever confident in his control and untouchable in his position, decided to personally sample the food he had long deemed suitable only for the enslaved. He approached the table with his usual air of superiority, convinced that nothing could surprise him, and that the meals, no matter how meager, were beneath his concern. To him, the idea that the food could pose any challenge or discomfort was laughable. He took the first bite with a smug sense of entitlement, expecting the bland, gritty fare to be, at worst, slightly unpleasant. But almost immediately, his confidence began to falter. The texture, coarse and uneven, gritted against his teeth, and the rancid odor hit his nostrils, a sharp reminder of the neglect and filth he had long ignored. The flavors, spoiled, over-salted, and mixed with grit, assaulted his senses, something he had never experienced at his own dining table. The master's arrogance turned to shock, then to horror. He gagged and coughed, a crimson flush spreading across his face as the reality of the food hit him fully. It was not just unpleasant, it was a taste of the suffering he had imposed for years, a physical manifestation of the cruelty he had wielded. The enslaved people, watching from a distance, could hardly conceal their mixture of fear and grim satisfaction. This was a moment that upended the usual hierarchy. The master, the arbiter of cruelty, was suddenly subjected to the very suffering he had long enforced. In that instant, the power dynamic shifted, if only briefly. His pride, so long a shield against empathy or remorse, cracked under the sheer intensity of the experience. The first bite was more than a meal. It was a reckoning, an unavoidable confrontation with the consequences of his own actions, forcing him to face, in the most immediate and humiliating way, the suffering he had inflicted on others. The moment the master swallowed the first bite of the food he had long forced his slaves to endure, the consequences hit him with shocking force. Physically, his body rebelled immediately. The rancid taste burned his throat, the gritty texture scraped his mouth, and nausea rose like a tide he could not stop. He gagged violently, clutching at the edge of the table, beads of sweat forming on his forehead as his stomach churned. His normally commanding posture crumpled, the arrogance that had defined him for years dissolved into sheer vulnerability. Emotionally, the impact was even more profound. Shock, disbelief, and humiliation coursed through him in waves. For the first time, he was forced to confront the suffering he had inflicted, not as an abstract concept, not through reports or whispers, but through his own senses. The bitterness of the spoiled meal mirrored the bitterness he had spread in the lives of those he enslaved. Panic and regret mingled with fear. He realized that the world he had controlled through cruelty had an unpredictable way of turning against him. The enslaved people, quietly observing from the shadows, felt a mix of awe and relief. Though fear still lingered, they knew the master's wrath could strike at any moment. They also bore witness to a rare moment of poetic justice. His cries and contorted expressions were a silent confirmation of what they had long endured. The food was unfit, the treatment cruel, and the suffering real. This experience left a mark on the master beyond physical sickness. Pride shattered, his sense of superiority shaken. He could no longer dismiss the human cost of his tyranny so easily. That night became a turning point, a moment when the consequences of oppression were laid bare in the most intimate, visceral way possible, through taste, pain, and undeniable humility. The enslaved people watched from the shadows, a mixture of fear, disbelief, and a subtle, quiet satisfaction coursing through them. For years, they had endured relentless cruelty, starvation, and humiliation at the hands of the master, yet they had learned to conceal any signs of resentment. Now, from the corners of the cabin and the edges of the yard, they witnessed a moment that defied the rigid hierarchy they had known. The master, so long untouchable, faltering under the very suffering he had imposed on them. Whispers ran among them, careful and cautious, like sparks flickering in the dark. Some covered their mouths to suppress stifled laughter. Others stared in wide-eyed shock, unsure whether this was real or a dream. Fear still held them tightly. He was, after all, the master, capable of swift and brutal retribution. But the sight of his helpless gagging, the grimace of pain, and the look of disbelief etched on his face stirred a sense of vindication they had never felt openly before. Some older slaves nodded to one another in silent acknowledgement. This was justice of a kind they had long imagined, but never dared hope to see. They had survived every day under oppression, sharing scraps, comforting one another through illness, and dreaming of freedom. Now, they saw that even the master was not immune to consequence, and that knowledge was both chilling and strangely empowering. Emotionally, the moment was complex, relief mixed with caution, satisfaction mingled with the persistent anxiety of living under tyranny. But above all, it was a powerful reminder that the cruelty they endured had limits, and that those who wielded power without empathy could be made to confront the weight of their actions. In that night, the enslaved witnessed a rare, almost surreal reversal. The master, once untouchable, humbled by the very means he used to dominate them, leaving a memory that would echo in their stories for years to come. That night, the usual hierarchy of the plantation seemed to shiver under an unspoken tension. The master, so accustomed to absolute control, was now reduced to a figure of vulnerability. Every glance from the enslaved people carried a complex mix of fear, curiosity, and quiet defiance. Even though they had long been forced to obey, the shift in power dynamics, subtle yet undeniable, was impossible to ignore. In the cabins and along the edges of the yard, small groups of enslaved workers exchanged looks and hushed words. Some tried to suppress their relief or satisfaction, knowing that overt reactions could still provoke wrath. Others, particularly those who had endured the harshest punishments, felt a surge of vindication. The psychological weight that had long bound them to obedience seemed, for a fleeting moment, to lighten. They were witnessing a rare imbalance in a system designed to strip them of autonomy. Meanwhile, the master's own behavior intensified the tension. His coughing, gagging, and flushed expressions betrayed his panic, undermining the fear he usually inspired. Even his trusted overseers, who had been his instruments of power, seemed momentarily uncertain, unsure how to intervene or assert authority in a situation that had flipped so dramatically. Every sound, the clatter of utensils, the scrape of a chair, a stifled whisper, seemed amplified in the charged atmosphere, each one feeding into the suspense. The plantation, normally dominated by strict routines and fear, now felt like a stage for a dramatic reversal. The enslaved, aware of every nuance, experienced a complicated mix of emotions: fear that the reprisal might come next, awe at witnessing the master humbled, and cautious hope that even the smallest cracks in tyranny could be exploited. That night's tension was palpable, a living, breathing presence that threaded through every cabin, every field, and every shadowed corner, setting the stage for a lesson in power, consequence, and human endurance that would linger long after the meal was over. The shocking events of that night did not remain confined to the borders of the Georgia plantation for long. Among the enslaved and even some of the white workers, stories of the master's humiliation began to circulate quietly, whispered from cabin to cabin, from field to field. These retellings carried a mixture of awe, disbelief, and cautious pride, each version growing in vividness as it passed from mouth to mouth. By the next day, the tale had traveled beyond the plantation itself, reaching neighboring estates like a ripple across still water. The narrative of the master gagging and choking on the very meals he had forced upon his slaves became a cautionary tale, both a source of dark amusement and a stark lesson in poetic justice. Enslaved people on other plantations would exchange nods or quiet comments when the story was mentioned, sharing a subtle, communal recognition of the momentary reversal of power. Even overseers and nearby laborers, while careful not to speak too freely, could not entirely suppress curiosity and shock at such an unexpected twist. Among the masters and the planter class, rumors traveled with a different tone, gossip mixed with embarrassment, disbelief, and in some cases, thinly veiled fear. If one's authority could be undone so publicly by a meal, what other vulnerabilities might exist? The incident became a quiet topic of conversation at gatherings and marketplaces, each retelling reinforcing the extraordinary nature of the event and embedding it into the folklore of the region. For the enslaved people, these stories served as more than entertainment. They were reminders that even those who wielded absolute power were not invincible. The tale spread like a shadow over the countryside, a symbol of the precariousness of tyranny and a subtle spark of hope. It became a shared narrative of endurance, justice, and the unexpected ways in which cruelty could boomerang back on its source, strengthening the bonds of collective memory among those who had long suffered under oppression. The events of that night left lasting psychological scars and unexpected lessons on both sides of the plantation hierarchy. For the master, the experience was nothing short of a mental shock. His arrogance, built over years of unchecked cruelty, had been shattered by the very suffering he had imposed on others. Each gag, each grimace, each moment of nausea became a mirror reflecting the pain and humiliation he had inflicted for decades. Pride, which had been his most defining trait, crumbled under the weight of humiliation, leaving him vulnerable, shaken, and uncertain of his control. For days afterward, he struggled to assert authority with the same confidence as before, a subtle fear lingering every time he looked at the enslaved workers who had witnessed his downfall. For the enslaved people, the psychological impact was complex and layered. There was a sense of vindication, proof that even the master, who seemed untouchable, could be brought low. This moment reaffirmed their resilience and underscored the small ways in which endurance and patience could, even temporarily, shift the balance of power. Yet it was tempered by caution. The master remained dangerous, capable of retaliation at any moment. The relief and satisfaction were mingled with the present fear of punishment, creating a tense emotional cocktail of hope, satisfaction, and vigilance. The incident also altered relationships within the household and fields. The master's aura of invincibility, previously absolute, had been tarnished. Slaves grew subtly bolder in their quiet conversations, in their glances, and in their small acts of mutual support, sensing that the rigid social order was not as unassailable as it had seemed. Meanwhile, the master became increasingly paranoid, obsessively monitoring food, behavior, and loyalty, haunted by the memory of that night. Psychologically, the event became a turning point for the master, a lesson in vulnerability and consequence. For the enslaved, a proof of resilience and a rare, almost unspoken empowerment. The memory of that night would echo in every interaction on the plantation, a silent reminder of how cruelty, no matter how carefully wielded, could rebound in unexpected ways. The events of that fateful night on the Georgia plantation carry profound lessons about the nature of cruelty, power, and empathy. Lessons that resonate far beyond that single estate. First and foremost, it revealed the inevitable limits of unchecked cruelty. The master had relied on fear, deprivation, and humiliation to maintain absolute control, believing himself untouchable. Yet the very tools he used to dominate others, starvation, neglect, and abuse, became instruments of his own discomfort and ultimately his psychological unraveling. This illustrates a timeless truth: cruelty, when wielded relentlessly, contains within it the seeds of its own consequences. Secondly, the night highlighted the fragile nature of power rooted in oppression. Authority that depends on fear alone is inherently unstable. The enslaved people's quiet endurance, their whispered stories, and their small acts of survival created a collective strength that, while invisible on a day-to-day basis, could witness and even indirectly shape events in ways the master could not predict. Power maintained by dominance alone is never absolute. It can be challenged, even subtly, and moments of justice, however small, can emerge from patience and resilience. Finally, this story underscores the value of empathy, or rather, the cost of its absence. The master's inability to recognize the humanity of those he enslaved led him to treat them as less than human, denying them nourishment, dignity, and safety. When he was forced to confront the consequences of his actions firsthand, he experienced a fraction of the suffering he had caused. The lesson is stark: a life devoid of empathy fosters cruelty, which inevitably rebounds, sometimes in ways that cannot be ignored or escaped. For the enslaved, these lessons were lived truths. They had endured, survived, and retained their humanity despite unimaginable conditions. For anyone reflecting on the story today, the events remind us that power without compassion corrodes the wielder, that cruelty is never one-sided, and that human endurance and empathy are forces capable of outlasting tyranny. In this way, the night the master had to taste the food he served became more than a moment of irony. It became a moral lesson etched into history, a dark parable of justice, consequence, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The night the Georgia master was forced to eat the same meager, spoiled food he had long served to his enslaved workers stands as a stark example of poetic justice, a moment where history itself seemed to pause and reflect the principle that cruelty often returns to its source. The irony is unmistakable. The very meals designed to subjugate and weaken others became an instrument of humiliation and discomfort for the oppressor. It is a chilling reminder that the abuse of power carries consequences, sometimes immediate and sometimes slow, but inevitably felt. This incident also offers a reflection on the nature of justice in oppressive systems. Formal justice, in the form of courts or laws, rarely touched the lives of enslaved people who were denied basic rights and protections. Yet, justice found a different expression that night, not through legislation, but through the subtle, almost karmic, reversal of roles. The master, accustomed to inflicting suffering without reprieve, encountered a taste, literally and figuratively, of the harm he had caused. For the enslaved, witnessing this reversal, even briefly, was a reminder that cruelty could be challenged, even in a world designed to suppress it. The poetic irony lies not only in the immediate consequences, but in the symbolic resonance of the event. History often remembers the oppressed through their suffering. But here, the memory is preserved in the act of reversal, where human endurance meets cosmic irony. It becomes a story passed down as both warning and lesson. Those who wield power without conscience may feel invincible, but oppression carries within it the potential for reckoning. Ultimately, this story illustrates how acts of cruelty echo through time and how justice, in its many forms, formal, poetic, or moral, often finds a way to assert itself. The night the master tasted his own cruelty is etched into history, not merely as a moment of humiliation, but as a testament to the enduring human understanding that power abused will eventually face consequences, and that, even in the darkest histories, irony can serve as a moral compass. While the master's humiliation demonstrates the consequences of cruelty, the story also highlights the incredible resilience and survival instincts of the enslaved people. Despite enduring relentless abuse, starvation, and deprivation, they continued to persevere, physically, emotionally, and mentally. Their survival was not passive, it was a daily, active resistance. Every whispered word of caution, every shared scrap of food, every small act of solidarity in the cabins or fields was a testament to their ingenuity and determination to endure under impossible circumstances. The enslaved developed a mental toughness that allowed them to navigate a world designed to break them. They cultivated patience, observation, and adaptability, learning when to speak and when to remain silent, when to hide suffering and when to quietly support one another. Their endurance was a form of silent power, invisible to the master, yet essential for their survival. This resilience created a network of trust and subtle rebellion, where small acts, sharing food, offering comfort, or quietly laughing at the absurdities of cruelty, became lifelines. That night, as the master faced the bitter taste of the very food he had used as an instrument of oppression, the enslaved witnessed a vindication of sorts, but it was their resilience, honed over years of hardship, that had made it possible to survive long enough to see such moments unfold. The lesson is timeless. Human strength is often measured not by the absence of suffering, but by the ability to endure, adapt, and maintain dignity in the face of relentless adversity. Their story teaches us that survival is more than mere existence. It is the capacity to retain humanity, hope, and even subtle forms of agency, even when every aspect of life is controlled by cruelty. The endurance of the enslaved becomes a silent triumph, a powerful counterpoint to the fleeting and fragile authority of the master. As we look back on this chilling episode from a Georgia plantation, it becomes clear that the story carries lessons far beyond a single act of poetic justice. It is a stark reminder of the cruelty that defines slavery, the immense suffering endured by the enslaved, and the fragility of power built on oppression. The master's humiliation, forced to eat the very meals he had long used to control others, is a moment frozen in time, both horrifying and strangely instructive. It forces us to confront the human capacity for cruelty and the consequences that inevitably follow when empathy is absent. Yet, equally important is the perspective of the enslaved. Their resilience, resourcefulness, and quiet resistance under unimaginable hardship highlight the strength of the human spirit. History often records the voices of the powerful, but stories like this illuminate the courage and endurance of those who were systematically silenced. The enslaved endured hunger, illness, and abuse, yet they maintained community, hope, and, in rare moments like this, witnessed a subtle but meaningful reversal of injustice. Remembering this story is crucial, not just as a tale of revenge or irony, but as a reflection of the deep injustices of the past and the moral lessons they carry. It challenges us to consider how power should be wielded, how cruelty harms both the victim and the perpetrator, and how resilience and endurance can survive even in the darkest circumstances. Ultimately, this night on the Georgia plantation becomes more than a historical anecdote. It becomes a lens through which we examine justice, empathy, and human endurance. It reminds us that while oppression can dominate the body, it cannot fully extinguish the spirit, and that the echoes of these dark truths continue to shape our understanding of history today.